Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Katina Rogers. I'm the Director of Administration and Programs for the Futures Initiative, and I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you to today's discussion on racism, xenophobia, populism, and the miseducation of the public. This is the first event that we're hosting this year, and as we were planning this summer, we knew that we wanted to do something that was timely. Unfortunately, this particular topic has proven to be tragically timely. As everyone else here, I saw last night and waking up this morning the news of Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, yet another person who has been killed by police after a routine traffic stop. All of us here in New York saw the news of the explosions in New York City and New Jersey and the aftermath of the wave of anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric that followed in its footsteps. And so I personally am particularly glad that we can have space for this conversation here today, and I'm really looking forward to everything that our speakers and our moderator can bring for us all. For those of you who are a little bit newer to the Futures Initiative, I'll just tell you a few words about our program, and then I'll turn things over to our speakers and our moderator. So our mission at the Futures Initiative is to promote equity and innovation in higher education through programs that emphasize engaged pedagogy, leadership development, and the use of technology for community building and public outreach. Last year, we started this series, The University Worth Fighting For, as a series of discussions that connected pedagogy and research with social justice and institutional change. And we're pleased to continue that series this year. It feels like an important set of topics to engage with, especially in today's political climate. So in addition to today's important discussion, we will be hosting topics this year on themes such as diversity in STEM education, race and media, accessibility and design, and global perspectives in higher education. In addition to these public events, which will all be live streamed, this spring we'll be hosting 5 interdisciplinary team-taught courses that connect with the same themes. So anyone who's a graduate student here at the Grad Center, we would really encourage you to think about enrolling in those courses. And finally, if you're a CUNY faculty member at any of the CUNY schools who might be interested in team teaching a course along those lines next year in 2017, 2018, is that right? Yeah. We have a call for proposals that's currently open until November 1st, so we'd welcome your ideas for a course that you might team teach with another CUNY faculty member. We have information about all of those courses and the University Worth Fighting For series on flyers that are on the tables and at futuresinitiative.org. And now I'm delighted to introduce Keetana Ananda, who joins us this year as the postdoctoral fellow for the Futures Initiative and the Humanities Alliance, which is a partnership between the Graduate Center and LaGuardia Community College, supported by the Mellon Foundation. Keetana holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Columbia University, and her work examines the culture and politics of war, migration, and diaspora in North America and South Asia, with a focus on Tamil refugees and immigrants from Sri Lanka. Welcome, Keetana. Thank you.
Thank you, Katina. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our first event in the University Worth Fighting For series on racism, xenophobia, and populism, the miseducation of the public. This event was organized to address issues of increasing concern to many of us today. And we have invited scholars and activists, all of them educators in their own right, with varying areas of expertise and frameworks to discuss these issues of racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia, and in relation to public higher education. If you'd like to help us take notes, you can use our Google Doc, which is available at bit.ly/fight4edu-racism. We're also live streaming this event, and if you're tweeting, you can use the hashtag #fight4, the number 4, that is, edu. Again, that's #fight4edu. So without further ado, let me get on with the task of introducing our amazing panelists. We first have Mary Phillips. Professor Mary Phillips received her PhD in African and African American Studies from Michigan State University. She is an assistant professor at Lehman College, CUNY. Her research explores women and gender in the Black Panther Party, Her most recent publication, The Power of the First-Person Narrative, Ericka Huggins and the Black Panther Party, is in the Women's Studies Quarterly and has been nominated for the Association of Black Women Historians Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book and Article Award. She is currently completing a book manuscript titled A Spirit on a Sword, Ericka Huggins' Life as a Panther, Educator, and Activist. Please join me in welcoming Mary Phillips.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about my work on the Black Panther Party. I'm going to talk a little bit about the miseducation of the Black Panther Party, as well as the miseducation around the role of women in the Black Panther Party. And then I'm going to connect that with Black Lives Matter and kind of what does that mean for us today in this moment of crisis that we are living in. On the front cover of the July 12, 1969 issue of the Black Panther, an enlarged picture of a mother and child depicts them in a rat-infested apartment. The picture shows a mother with a loaded rifle pointing at a hole in the wall to kill rats as they enter her apartment. The significance of this picture represents a mother staving off danger against her home. The staff of the party's famed publication chose Minister of Culture Emory Douglas's political artwork as the cover of the Black Panther during a critical time when members discussed the complexities of gender politics. Previously a stance traditionally assigned to men, the mother in this case fulfills the role of protector of the entire family, which includes not only the children, but the father as well, and challenges women merely as complementary to men. This image speaks to the historical legacy of Black women's activism from slavery to freedom and disrupts the notion that self-defense was reserved for men. The leadership of women, including Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Amy Jacques Garvey, Rosa Parks, Gloria Richardson, and Mabel Williams influenced radical female activists of the late 1960s and early 1970s. These women laid the foundation for Black women's activism in the Black Panther Party. Women found refuge in the Black Panther Party because they wanted to serve their community in very practical ways. However, there is a skewed public image of female revolutionaries as silent helpmates and background characters. Women were involved in all aspects of the party's activities and community programming, including the People's Free Medical Research Health Clinics, the free breakfast program for children, the free ambulance program, the free employment and cooperative housing program, as well as involvement in various educational initiatives, teaching political education classes, selling the Panther newspaper, running electoral campaigns, and serving on the Central Committee. Essentially, women ran the Black Panther Party. They were critical to the survival of the organization. Specifically, Ericka Huggins, a high-ranking yet understudied figure, played an integral role in the operation and daily functioning of the party. In an interview I did with Ericka Huggins, she recalls a visit in 1968 to the Oakland National Headquarters at a house gathering with about 50 fellow comrades in attendance, a newly minted member of the Los Angeles branch, and 8 months pregnant at the time with her daughter Mai. She vividly recalls an incident involving gender politics, and I quote, "The women were the only ones cooking the food. I thought this was odd because in Los Angeles, everybody did everything. When the women finished cooking, a woman came out of the kitchen and said, 'Brothers, you can eat now.' I looked at that woman sitting next to me and I said to her, 'What does that mean? Does that mean that I have to wait and eat? Because I'm not.' And then I asked someone, 'What does that mean? The brothers can eat now.' And the woman who made the announcement said, 'Sister, brothers eat first.' And I said, 'Oh, no. Please excuse me while I go in the kitchen and fix my plate. I'm pregnant and I will eat now.' This story captures the bold and courageous spirit of Huggins, who evolved into one of the most extraordinary leaders in the history of the Black Panther Party. Her rebuttal and actions in challenging sexism within the Black Panther Party served as a form of political agency. Born Ericka Cosette Jenkins on January 5, 1948 in Washington, D.C., she joined the Black Panther Party in 1967. As a Panther, she served in many capacities, including working as editor of the newspaper. Also, when her husband, John Huggins, were murdered by COINTELPRO agents on January 17, 1969, she moved to his hometown and opened a BPP branch in New Haven, Connecticut. However, months later, police arrested her and Chairman Bobby Seale for kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy charges. In prison, she practiced political interventions such as meditation, poetry, writing, chanting, and the collaborative formation of the Sister Love Collective, a support group for newly admitted female prisoners. They use hair as a space to build a tight-knit community. She awaited trial for almost 2 years before the state dropped the charges. Her daughter was 2.5 when she was released from prison. Huggins' incarceration became a critical component in the evolution of gender politics in the Black Panther Party. Her resistance strategies in prison situated her as an icon for women in the party. Despite the governmental assaults, she demanded her own humanity on her own terms. Upon the release, she served as director of the famed Black Panther Party's Oakland Community School, maintaining its daily affairs from 1973 to 1981. In addition to supervising and managing staff members, she co-wrote the curriculum, wrote grants for the school. She traveled around the country delivering presentations on the school pedagogy, and she became the first Black person elected to the Alameda County Board of Education. She worked on the Central Committee. She was a poet. Upon leaving the Black Panther Party after 14 years, she became a mind-body practitioner in which she utilized yoga, mindfulness, and relaxation techniques as a tool to educate, support, and improve the quality of life of individuals, particularly women and children in prisons, schools, healthcare settings, social groups, among other places. In pop culture and mass media, there's a growing interest in the Black Power era, particularly as we embark on the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party happening next month. From the release of Stanley Nelson's Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, megastar Beyonce's performance at the Super Bowl, the release of Black Panther Party syllabi, as well as new scholarly treatments on the Black Panther Party. Within the last decade, a new generation of activists are reclaiming the Panthers in their quest to combat police brutality and multiple forms of oppression on communities of color. Many contemporary movements have adopted the Panthers' praxis in their organizing strategies. For example, Black Lives Matter mirrors the Black Panther Party in their guiding principles, which includes an emphasis on self-defense, empathy, the power of the collective, restorative justice, and a manifestation of loving engagements with one another, and family-friendly spaces that enable parents to fully participate with their children to alleviate the patriarchal practice of mothers working double shifts while also balancing social activism. Just like the Panthers, they understand that they are part of a global community, and they are proudly and unapologetically Black. Furthermore, Black Lives Matter believes in the development of an intergenerational communal network that embraces ageism. This is modeled in the Black Panther Party's Seniors Against the Fearful Environment, the Panthers' initiative to serve the needs of elders in the community. So they practice this relationship where there is respect, There is a space of learning that goes on with your elders and with young people in the community. Although the Black Lives Matter movement was started by self-identified Black queer women, Black women and girls are often silenced from the national narrative of police violence on Black bodies. Many of us can name many of the Black boys and men who have been killed by police violence, but we cannot name Black girls and women in the same way. Just like Black men and boys, Black women and girls are intentional targets of police violence and mass assault. This is the reason why the hashtag Say Her Name has such relevance and power, because it gives Black women and girls a voice that they had not been given. This is indeed another similarity of Black Lives Matter, as women's activism in the Black Panther Party remains largely unknown to the masses. Despite the sexism, misogyny, and patriarchy of our country, Black Lives Matter pushes onward, championing the work of the Black Panther Party in their fight for the liberation of oppressed communities and reclaiming that Black lives do indeed matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Jessie Daniels. Jessie Daniels is a professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, an internationally recognized expert on internet manifestations of racism. Daniels is the author of 2 books about race and various forms of media, White Lies and Cyber Racism, as well as dozens of peer-reviewed articles. In 2014, Context magazine called her a pioneer in digital sociology. Daniels has also worked in the internet industry. She writes regularly at Racism Review, a scholarly blog that she co-founded and has maintained since 2007. Forbes magazine named her one of 20 inspiring women to follow on Twitter, and you can find her there as Jessie NYC. Please welcome Jessie Daniels.
Hi, I'm having just a little technical problem. Okay, so maybe I won't talk with slides today, that's fine. So I posted a lovely slide deck for you all to look at on your own on the Twitter hashtag, but I'll just talk about what I know of my own work from memory. So I started researching white supremacist groups, extremist white supremacist groups in the 1990s, and I did that as part of my dissertation. And I was studying at the University of Texas at Austin, and I traveled to, but it comes up on Keynote, and so it's all long. Okay, so sorry. That's okay. Yeah, so I was studying at the University of Texas at Austin, and to study white supremacist groups in the early, late 80s, early 1990s, I had to travel to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Southern Poverty Law Center's Klan Watch archive. So they had collected paper documents from these white supremacist groups, and I traveled the 700 miles or so from Austin to Montgomery and stood over a hot copier for several days and made Xerox copies of these newsletters, and then I analyzed them using a qualitative content analysis. And part of what I found in that research, which was my dissertation and became my first book called White Lies, were a couple of things that were surprising to me. The first one was that white supremacy and the extremist rhetoric that I was looking at there, and these are groups like Tom Metzger's White Aryan Resistance, David Duke's group, the National Association for the Advancement of White People, so a whole range of groups on the far right. One of the things I found that surprised me was that there was a real way in which the white supremacist rhetoric was gendered, that language about whites was gendered along lines of masculinity and femininity. What they said about white men and white women was very different. And I had gone in expecting a kind of laundry list of groups that they hated or had grudges against, and what I found was that there was a real focus on constructions of whiteness, of blackness, and of Jewishness, and within each one of those groups, there was a gendered construction. The other thing that surprised me about what I found when I started reading these these newsletters and documents was the way that this extremist literature really resonated with the mainstream political rhetoric and what was going on in popular culture at the time. So this is the early 1990s, and Pat Buchanan gave a speech at the Republican National Convention in 1992 that resonated very, very closely with the themes that I was reading in those extremist publications. About the same time, the Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, or president at the time, Bill Clinton, was excoriating a black woman rapper by the name of Sister Souljah, and the kinds of language that he used to talk about her was very similar to the way that black women were constructed in these extremist publications. And just a little bit before that, in 1988, the current GOP frontrunner was a real estate developer then, and he had taken out a full-page ad in the New York papers calling for the death penalty, bring back the death penalty for the young brown and black men who were accused of the Central Park jogger attack. And that ad looked very much like the ads a century before that advertised that a lynching was about to take place. They were very, very similar in the rhetoric. So that was my early work. I looked at those in the 90s. I published this book, White Lies. It came out in 1997. Time marches on. The internet arises, right? The rise of the popular internet. I began once the internet started becoming really popular. I started taking my classes into the computer lab at the university where I taught, and a shocking thing happened. Shocking for me because it really made me rethink what my research was about. I had two undergraduate students. One, the very first day I took this race and ethnicity class into the computer lab, the first student typed in kkk.com into the search engine. So before Google, the search engine was Alta Vista or something. And another student, the second student, typed in Martin Luther King. Both of those searches in those old search engines ended up at white supremacist sites. The KKK one obviously ended up at an extremist and obviously extremist site, but the Martin Luther King search ended up at a site that I later came to refer to as a cloaked site. It's martinlutherking.org. If you've never seen it, it appears to be a tribute site to Dr. King, but in fact, it's run by white supremacists. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that page, you'll see that it says, run by or supported by Stormfront, which is the largest white supremacist portal online. Most people don't scroll all the way to the bottom. 80% of us never scroll to the bottom of the web page, and my students certainly weren't. So I spent the next few years trying to figure out, how do I study this? How do I study young people stumbling upon these kinds of sites? And through a series of trial and error, basically what I came up with was a kind of quasi-experimental design, and part of what I did was ask young people, 15 to 19, to go online, and I would follow them as they surf the web. And I said, pretend you're doing a research paper for school, and how would you evaluate these sites? One of the things I found was that they had, they were very good at sussing out bad graphic design. So part of what they said about the Martin Luther King site was, well, this looks kind of funky. It looks like just an individual created it. I probably wouldn't use this, right? Which in one way is really, is great. It's a kind of new literacy. They sort of understand bad background colors and bad fonts and that sort of thing. The pernicious thing, right, is that white supremacists just need a better graphic designer, right, for a more pernicious presence online. But the troubling thing came when I got to a different white supremacist site online that had taken oral history records from the Library of Congress, from the WPA, where they had interviewed former people who were formerly enslaved and asked them about that experience. And this white supremacist had gone along and taken some of those quotes out of context and posted them under a site that said Forgotten Black Voices, and basically was making the argument that slavery wasn't that bad. And so I interviewed some of these participants in my research. What do you think about this? And one of my young participants, who went to an elite high school here in New York City, said, well, it's, I can see that argument. There's two sides to everything. Right? So this rhetorical strategy, one of the points that I wanted to make today is that this rhetorical strategy, where these hard-won moral and legal battles, like the triumph over slavery, a common white supremacist strategy is to throw us back into debate over those hard-won legal issues. And that's part of what's happening with the internet and with the rise of Trumpism, if we can call it that, right? That these things that are hard-won moral and political victories, we're now debating again. So just recently, Bill O'Reilly of Fox News had made a very similar statement that slaves were well-fed and so it wasn't that bad, right? So we're again, in 2016, back to debating, was slavery a moral evil? Was it that bad, right? And that's a way that this mechanism works. So the other thing that I just wanted to end by saying has to do with the rise of Trump and his connection to the alt-right and white supremacists. It's no coincidence that he is retweeting and sharing information from white supremacists. He shares those views, whether he will admit that or own that. But the sort of evil genius that he brings is this conflation of reality TV and social media. So these same themes that I saw in the 1990s from these printed white supremacist publications, Trump is recirculating these, but he's putting them in the frame of reality TV, amplified also by Fox News, and then shared again on Twitter. So we're seeing this, it's a consistent message that we're seeing. It hasn't really changed, it's not really new, but he brings a sort of new amplification of those same messages. So I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Linda Sarsour. Linda Sarsour is the Executive Director of the Arab American Association of New York and a co-founder of the first Muslim organizing platform, Empower Change. She has been at the forefront of major civil rights organizing campaigns, including calling for an end to unwanted surveillance of New York's Muslim communities and ending policies like stop and frisk. In the wake of the police murder of Mike Brown, she co-founded Muslims for Ferguson to build solidarity among American Muslim communities and encourage work against police brutality. Linda is also a member of the Justice League NYC, a leading force of activists, formerly incarcerated individuals, and artists working to reform the New York Police Department and the criminal justice system. She is a working woman, racial justice and civil rights activist, every Islamophobe's worst nightmare, and mother of 3. Ambitious, outspoken, and independent, Linda shatters stereotypes of Muslim women while also treasuring her religious and ethnic heritage. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Linda Sarsour.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. So I am the non-academic on this panel, so bear with me. I am quite actually humbled and honored to be on a panel with these fabulous women. So I'm going to talk to you as an activist and as a product of the New York City public school system, as a product of CUNY, and my journey in understanding that I was basically shortchanged in education, and I've had to learn many things the hard way based on my own exploration. And I wanted to just look at 3 different areas. As a Muslim in this country and looking at the rise of Islamophobia, and I want to kind of get to the root of the problem, because people want to use that word radical, so I just want to put this out there. I'm a proud radical. I'm not ashamed of anyone calling me a radical, because radical is about getting to the root of the issue. And when I think about Islamophobia and the rise of Islamophobia, the root of the issue is education in our education system. It is because there is no stories that are being told in our education system about the lineage of Muslims in this land that go and originate back to even before the founding of this nation. We also know that 25 to 30% of enslaved people who came to this country, enslaved Africans, were Muslim. And somehow, I don't know how they did this, but somehow they figured out how to continue to practice Islam even under the watch of their slave masters. So for people like me to stand up here today in front of you in a hijab, Muslim, and unapologetically Muslim, is because my lineage is so deep that someone sacrificed for me to be here today as a Muslim. But that's not the story that's being told in our public education system. We are being taught Islam as some foreign entity, something that belongs on the other side of the world, and we speak about it only from that context. So when people are hearing these conversations about terrorism and terrorist attacks, and they think about it from the perspective of this kind of global religion that belongs on some other side of the world, and no one's talking about the deep-rootedness of Islam in this country. When I think about the conversations that we're hearing around us as people, as New Yorkers, as Americans, around terrorism, you know, we're being told that we got to counter violent extremism in this country, you know, because violent extremism can only mean that it's Muslims, right? No one wants to talk about any other violent extremism in this country, which most often since 9/11 actually is more violent extremism at the hand of white supremacists than it is at the hands of Muslims, but we won't talk about that. And I always ask people, and I challenge people, in the media when I'm being put in this frame about what do I have to say about a terrorist attack. So what people want me to say is Muslims for some really terrible thing that just happened. And I'm not going to say that. My question is for us to challenge ourselves, which we're not being challenged into doing critical thinking, into asking ourselves the deep question. Where was ISIS 6 years ago? Did anybody ever hear of ISIS before? Did they just wake up one morning, put on an outfit and say, we're ISIS today? This idea that we're not being asked about the root problems of international terrorism and why is it that we as Americans right now are targets of this terrorism is really deeply troubling to me. And our safety as Americans, as New Yorkers, is at risk because of the fact that we're not getting to the root issues that are happening around the world. And I think that, again, is the weakness that we have in our political analysis, in our analysis of the impact of the war on terror globally, both abroad and here domestically, and all of our foreign policy mishaps that we've had. You know, let's be real, people. We've killed millions of people across the world, and there are people who hate us. Yeah. Can somebody talk about that, you know? You know, you kill my child, you come and bomb my wedding of my brother, and then you want people to be like, that's cool, we're good, that's all right. People have to understand the impact of our foreign policy, of our taxpayer dollars, and how that's going to impact us here. It's not a justification of violence, it's a challenge and a call to action for us to have deep critical thinking that is missing in our national conversation that we're having about countering violent extremism and terrorism. Another area that I think has really deeply impacted the way I think about words and how I was taught is this idea of patriotism, right? Who's a patriot in this country? What does that mean to be a patriot? So we have been taught that a patriot is red, white, and blue, and it's the people that raise the American flag. And that's not really who I've ever been. And I'm a born and raised New Yorker, I'm a Brooklynite. No one can take my Americanness away from me, but this idea that this pledging to a flag that, for me as a Palestinian American, you know, where my taxpayer dollars go to, you know, fund the longest military occupation in the world that occupies my grandmother in Palestine. When I think about my taxpayer dollars and my American government, and that flag represents war in Iraq that killed at least 1 million Iraqis and thousands of Afghanis and other people that I also feel like I have an affinity to, sharing culture and sharing religion with. And we've been taught this idea of patriotism also from a white supremacist, you know, foundation, right? It's what white people think is patriotism. Yep. And if we don't subscribe to that type of patriotism, then we are not patriots. And for me, this idea of me wanting my country to be the best that it could be is what patriotism is. And dissent for me is the highest form of patriotism. So that for me has been a confusing concept, in particular for communities of color, Native and Indigenous people in this country. And I think has been the demise of our public education system, that we are still talking about patriotism under this umbrella of red, white, and blue, and, you know, we have to, you know, love our country so much that we have to be silent in the face of the injustices that it commits against its own people and against others. And that brings me to the conversation right now that we're having about, you know, Kaepernick, right? Colin Kaepernick of the 49ers. And I'm just like, really, people? Who gives a crap about a football player who felt like being silent and kneeling on the floor? Like, why is that the center of controversy? I thought that we lived in the United States of America, and I thought that we had the freedom to do whatever the heck we wanted, right? As long as we ain't hurting nobody. So this controversy goes back to the original point of this idea of who gets to set the standards of patriotism, who gets to say who gets to do what in this country. And again, it goes back to this very shallow understanding where no one ever wanted to talk to us about where those standards came from. And they're rooted in white supremacy. Everything that everyone talked about here is rooted in white supremacy. And that's, again, another misinformation. And what the alt-right does really well is the minute somebody says white supremacy, oh man, them racists, they don't like white people. This idea that there's such thing as reverse racism. There is no reverse racism. That doesn't exist. So there's been this conversation that's being pushed that if you want to talk about white supremacy, that means that you are racist against white people. When in fact, there are plenty of white people I know that are standing against white supremacy, and there's one right here on the stage sitting with us here today. And this idea about racism also, that, you know, what is racism actually? racism, everyone has bias. So I can be a person that's biased against white people. That's true, right? Everybody has biases, and we are human, and we have that. But racism is bigotry plus power. So if I don't have power, right, or if I'm not in a position of power, I can't be racist because I can't oppress you. You may be mad at me for comments I made, you might be offended, but it's not racism. And this idea that we can engage, or people of color can engage in reverse racism, is an absolute misinformation and miseducation. And then the last thing that I'll say for me around when I think about kind of the shortcomings of our education system is the way that people are trying to apply what they believe is history or the history of civil rights movements on the current movements that we're involved in, right? So the whitewashing of civil rights heroes. So people will tell you, Dr. Martin Luther King, oh man, he was a peaceful man. He was a man that brought white people and black people together. He was all about dialogue and, bringing people together. I'm like, I don't know what Dr. Martin Luther King you know. That's not the Dr. Martin Luther King that I know. The Dr. Martin Luther King that I know, it was a black radical revolutionary. He was a guy that cared about black people and the well-being of black people. He was also a victim of police brutality, right? And if he was so great and peaceful, you assassinated him at the age of 39. So I don't know how peaceful he was that it caused for someone to take the life of a man who supposedly was such a peaceful leader in our nation. Now, people will criticize current civil rights movement folks, including those that are organizing around, Black Lives Matter issues, or even some of the undocumented folks around the Dreamer movement, and saying that's not how Dr. Martin Luther King did it. That's not how the civil rights folks did it. And I'm like, what? And it brings me back to, look, that's what they know. That's what they've been taught. And we are not taught to explore and to read. When I read Dr. Jean Theo Harris's book, The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks. I already had a feeling about that. I knew somebody was shortchanging me somewhere, but I wasn't sure where. And I read that book and I was astonished at the 99% of things that I didn't know about the legacy and the history way before Rosa Parks ever was like, I'm not standing up on this bus. The fact that we don't have that knowledge prior to the conclusions that we make about what people should do and what people shouldn't do and what people did before us and what people didn't do before us is quite personally troubling to me. And I think that if I had the opportunity, and me personally, I'm a product of the New York City Public Schools. I also have children who are in the New York City Public School system. You better believe that my children are reading other books. I get my kids' books and I'm like, you're reading that book and on Saturday you're gonna tell me everything that you read, what you learned, top 3 things you got out of that book, because what my kids do is then they take that book and then they go back to school and they say to their teacher, my mom made me read this book. So for example, my daughter, I just bought her a book, The Beautiful Struggle by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and my daughter's astounded, right? And then there was his recent book also, when my daughter is 15 years old and she was like, Mom, it was weird. And I was like, what's weird? She's like, I was reading on a train and I cried. She's like, I never cried when I read a book. And I said, well, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be moved, reading people's personal stories and reading stories of pain and oppression. You're a human being. That's okay. You can do that. But I think that for me, I've learned that we as, in particular in academic space, and those of you who are aspiring professors and being able to challenge what people have already learned, sometimes having to deconstruct what people have already learned, sometimes eradicating from the minds of the people what they have already learned, and also being open to your students challenging you on sometimes the things that you teach, because we also sometimes want to teach people what we've learned. But sometimes what you're teaching, there's a quote, another side, or someone else wants to offer you something else, and being open-minded. So I'm grateful that I woke up and that I'm, people say, we're woke. I mean, I wasn't always woke, but I'm woke now. And I don't think I'm ever gonna go back to sleep. So I hope that we start seeing our education and public education in particular as maybe renaming it. Maybe the woke curriculum. Maybe that's what we're gonna call it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now have time to open up this discussion to questions from our audience. And before we take questions, I just want to review a few thoughts that we have about this process. We have 2 handheld mics up at the front available for anyone who would like to ask a question, and we can have folks pass those around. Our formal time for this discussion is limited to about the next 20 to 25 minutes. So we would like to ask, this is a very fruitful topic for discussion, but we would like to ask that you refrain from making extensive comments and limit your time to asking a question for our speakers. And remember that we will also have time to continue this discussion informally over coffee and snacks from 4 to 5 p.m. And finally, I just want to say, we recognize that public discussions about social justice are imbued with power relations that can make it difficult for some folks to speak or be heard. And so in this question and answer period, we would like to make space for the voices of people whose voices often get sidelined in these discussions. We ask that you please limit yourself to 1 question at a time to allow as many people to participate in this discussion as possible. And I'll be using a modified version of taking stack, which means that I'll note everyone who has a hand raised to speak before we'll pass the mic so that you can ask your questions. Let's open it up for some questions for our speakers. And anyone else? Does anyone else have a question? Okay, so over here.
There we go.
Okay, good.
So my name is Ty. I'm from the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. I have a question for Linda. Well, I guess it can be applicable to all of you. With the recent passing of Resolution 1058A, how do you feel about that impacting the rights of CUNY students to express their concerns about the issues between Palestinians and Israelis and, I guess, the limiting of voices on the conflict?
So I'll start. So I was at that hearing, and I testified at that hearing. And just for folks that don't know, the Resolution 1058A originated in the Contracts Committee of the New York City Council and basically condemns any BDS or delegitimizing the state of Israel was basically the resolution. So your New York City Council members basically are spending their time talking about that instead of bringing police reform legislation to the floor, but that's a whole other situation. One of the biggest arguments that was made in opposition to the resolution that I made and many people made is that I'm not here to convince anybody to support BDS. We could all agree to disagree on that as a tactic. But I think what was the most disturbing thing to me, and in particular it mentions academics and students in the resolution, is condemning those that choose to engage in BDS or boycott, divestment, sanction. And some of the most successful BDS or boycott, divestment campaigns have been out of CUNY, but also out of private universities across this country. And what's really interesting, it's again, people trying to reformat, reframe history when we try to align or make comparisons, and not 100% exact, because it's not the same exactly, but when people were trying to align, current BDS around Palestine and the rights of Palestinians to South African apartheid, and the fact that there are people, most of whom are white, right? Let's be real here. I'm going to put it out there. Like, I'm already in trouble about this. I was in the New York Post a few times, so I'm just going to put it out there. There were no people of color that were at that hearing that were like, we with you, we got, we're here with you, right? They didn't have anyone testify. They were all predominantly white men who came and basically condemned anyone that wanted to be part of BDS. And the argument that we made was it was about chilling free speech. You don't gotta agree with me, but you gotta agree with me to the death for my right to do and engage in any nonviolent tactics that I want. So what I think it's going to do is there are going to be those who will not be intimidated and will not be silenced, and that there will be those in particular communities of color who are already under what I call COINTELPRO 2.0, people who are whose chilled speech already exists based on law enforcement activity and surveillance of political movements and those based on race or religion. And that's what makes me afraid. And what makes me afraid is the chilling of free speech, in particular on college campuses, because I send my people to school and people go to college campuses to be radicalized, to be transformed, to engage in a whole range of social justice issues. And here we have our elected officials who are supposed to uphold the Constitution, basically saying, we let you do what you want, but when you don't agree with us, we're going to take you down. And the reason why I say that, people will say, so, why is it in the Contracts Committee? Why wasn't it in another committee? Are you telling me that nonprofit leaders, academic institutions who may get contracts through the New York City Council got to worry about where their positions or what their students do or how to control their students because they're afraid that they won't get funding? So we got to be aware of these things. So being in academia is important, being well-educated people, teaching people is important, but also being active in these political movements as people in academia is super critical at the moment that we're in right now.
Thank you.
Everything she said.
Are there any other questions for our speakers? Yes?
The history of some people, let's talk about Roma as the example, gypsies, they're targets. They've been targets. At much of the history, they've been in a weak position without any power. I don't tolerate any negativity, no word. I don't want a word against Roma or gypsies from anybody at any time. They've had their fill. All right, I can see how Jewish people might feel the same way. I can see how African Americans might feel the same way. I mean, people who have been targets, I think, have the right to be sensitive, have the right to, I won't say overreact, but to react in a vigorous manner, and free speech is no excuse. I don't tolerate a word against Roma or gypsies. It's just unacceptable. So let's hear that side of the story, rather than this, oh, everything's free, everything's open. I was born in 1988, and I don't remember any of the backgrounds of those people. No, that's not a way to approach this argument, in my opinion.
I'm sorry, are there any questions that we have for the speakers? Yeah, we've got a hand raised over here. Are there any? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble seeing over the podium. Are there any other questions on this side? All right. Yes, over here on this side of the room.
It was a question. I really appreciate bringing to attention the use of the word radical, or who defines as a radical. And I guess I really thought about it a lot this summer when I was in England after the Brexit vote, and somebody interpreted the Leave vote from really economically marginalized, white working class communities as not just a protest vote, but people who had been let down by a radical and progressive tradition, in this case the Labour Party in the UK. But also thinking about it in this context here, people who are not just disaffected with the status quo, but let's say the liberal establishment, or for a time has been the progressive liberal establishment, however we engage with that. But I'm wondering there, is it a battle? Should it be a fight over the radical legacy and trying to sort of rechannel those people who are disaffected but are drawn to a Trump politics towards a radical tradition of the left, but to sort of recognize that the reaction to being left behind, neglected, that there's something there to that radical energy that comes with that. I don't know, I find it perplexing, but I think something needs to be recognized there, or it does get channeled towards a radical right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a moment where we could reach out to some of the people who've been radicalized in a way by Trump and try and shift those politics. I mean, I was quite disheartened to hear Hillary Clinton's comments recently about the basket of deplorables, because I think in a way that sentiment, for those of you who missed this comment, she said that there was a certain segment of Trump supporters who were in this basket of deplorables, that they were basically unreachable. And I think that that's a common approach in a way on the left to thinking about people who have been radicalized by Trump. And the reality is a lot of those people had been Bernie Sanders supporters, right? Who went from Sanders to Trump, you know? And so I think in a lot of ways that there's a real lost opportunity for talking about some of the issues that have been raised by the left, but have really been dropped by the sort of mainstream Democratic, you know, liberal Democrats, you know, in the effort to be safe, to be centrist, you know, and quite frankly to be to hold up those systems of white supremacy. You know, I mean, there's not a real that I see. There's not a real alternative that's being offered to kind of entrenched white supremacy.
I just want to.
Yeah.
I just wanted to. You know, one thing about when we're talking about education is like the reclaiming of language. I don't even like the word radicalized being used to explain people who are being more racist by Trump.
Yeah.
I think radical, if we want to get back to the root definition of words, you know, this idea of getting to the root of the problem. I don't know if the Trump people are getting to the root of any problem. I think they think that they are, but they're not. And the reason why I reclaim that language is because radical has been used to criminalize communities, right? So like you will hear this idea of radicalization only used in the context of Muslims, right? So you don't want to ever be called, God forbid you see your name in a blog and someone's calling you radical anything, you're just outraged, right? I actually get quite proud of myself when I see myself described in that way. But what I will say also is, you know, this, we always talk about things from a political perspective, like radical left, leftist. I don't want to be left because the left also engages in Islamophobia. The left engages in racism. I don't want to be called progressive either. The progressive people, progressive except for Palestine, progressive except on policing, right? And, you know, at that hearing, you know, I watched members of the Progressive Caucus vote in favor of this resolution. I have watched members of the Progressive Caucus not vote for common sense police reform legislation in the city and on the national and other state legislators, and including in our state legislator here. So I think that for me, you know, either we define clearly what we mean when we say progressive, and we have a very set of values that we all agree on, so we could be called progressive, or don't call me progressive or left or anything. I think that we have lost the clutch on language. Like, people are taking the language away and just defining things whatever the way they want and putting us into these boxes, and I don't want to be in boxes with people who don't believe that Black Lives Matter. I don't want to be in boxes with people who are super outraged about certain things, but when Black people are dying on our streets, you don't hear a peep out of them. Like, I don't want to be, if that's the progressive left, I don't want to be a part of it. So I think we need to challenge language, the use of the word radical, and also left and progressive and all these buzzwords that you hear people say. I think that unless we, I don't know, somebody writes a new book or something, or make some new definitions, I don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah. No, I agree with Linda totally, and I think that I think the other language that I find really problematic in this conversation has to do with extremist or extremism, and I know I mentioned that in talking about white supremacists, and I do that often just to sort of give people a way into the conversation, but part of the reason I think that the alt-right has been so effective is because it's rebranded white supremacist extremism in a way that people feel comfortable talking about. People don't, in general, white people don't feel comfortable talking about white supremacy, and I think that's really a term that we need to be talking about. So part of the problem with the way that extremism gets talked about is that there's a kind of equation between left and right, just sort of expanding on what Linda was saying. You know, so some people will compare the Klan to Black Panthers, not the same thing. There was recently a study where somebody did a Twitter analysis of how ISIS is using Twitter and white supremacists, neo-Nazis are using Twitter. Those are not the same. There is no comparison between those groups, and this frame of extremism is a false frame. It equates things that are not equivalent. So I think that the conversation that we need to be having is one about white supremacy, and that's a very difficult conversation for white people in this country to have.
And, you know, I would add with that, with the conversation about white supremacy, is also white privilege.
Yeah.
I find that, you know, when you mention the term white privilege, you know, it's all kinds of defense mechanisms and what have you, not really wanting to talk about a very important construct in the United States that has, you know, that benefits some people and, you know, doesn't benefit other people. I mean, it's extremely problematic. And so I just want to add with that.
Thank you. I believe we have time for a few more questions, so if there are any, yes, in the back of the room. Are there any additional questions? Oh, yes. over here.
I have really a comment. I think we create those divisions by dividing people into white, black, Muslims, radicals. I think we should start from trying, like, not putting people into boxes, just seeing them as American and human. I think dividing people into black, white, radical, left, it's even worse.
We have two more questions over here, maybe on the left here, and then the red sweatshirt. Yep.
Hi, I don't want to overgeneralize that we're all Americans and we have human rights and all that, because I feel like that's not really getting to the root of the problem. I was actually thinking of if you could give us sources that we could, I teach critical thinking at LaGuardia, so half of what you said kind of resonated with me. But I think helping them make that connection that they can create their own thoughts versus what they've learned themselves. It's not just a conversation I need to have with them. I need to have more sources to be able to show them that it's not just one person saying, well, if you start thinking about things in a different frame or different lens, then you can see other perspectives. So what kind of either books or websites or sources can I bring my students to say, well, it might not, and not too jargony or academically, that they can connect with, that they can see that, all right, there's more than just one side to Rosa Parks, there's more than just one side to the story we've been told, without kind of making it all about that, because I only have a limited time to get to perspective and framework in my own class.
So I want to echo a book that Linda mentioned earlier, which is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And then I actually started my grad seminar with that, but I think it's very accessibly written. You said your 15-year-old was reading. I mean, it's very moving and very powerful. And there's another one that I also recommended to my students to read before the semester started, which is Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which is a mix of prose and poetry. And to the comment that you were making about we often don't know the women's names of victims of police brutality, she really focuses on women's story and does a great analysis of Serena Williams. And anyway, it's a beautiful book, both of those two.
You can go on Amazon.
It's not, I don't think it's prohibitively expensive,
No.
but yeah.
Before we turn to the next question, I just want to ask whether our other speakers also have suggestions for resources about teaching race and Islamophobia in the classroom.
When I was teaching freshmen, there's this really good interactive website. I believe it's called Understanding Race or something like that. And it has videos on it. It has a mini documentary on it. Thank you for looking it up. But it has a mini documentary on it called A Girl Like Me, I believe. It's this young girl who redoes the Dow test. She redoes the Dow test today in this moment, and the results are the exact same results that it was back in the 1950s as far as these racial attitudes that black children have about themselves in relationship to toys and dolls. And it has all kinds of articles and little games in it, and just really gives you some language and some background knowledge, and really talking about these difficult concepts, So yeah, I think that's a really good one. And there's another topic that hasn't came up a lot, but when we talk about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, there's a really good TED Talk by Jason Katz, where he talks about how violence against women is a men's issue and not a women's issue. He talks about the way in which the media uses language to victimize women. It's an excellent TED Talk. It's only about 20 minutes, so those are some things that are really interactive for students.
And there's so much I could literally sit here for the next 3 weeks of things that I've read. But there's a since we're our Ta-Nehisi Coates, literally we're his PR team over here. But there was a piece that he wrote for The Atlantic called "The Case for Reparations" that I think everybody should read. I don't care if you agree or not. It's really very thought-provoking, and also supporting kind of the news stories coming out of communities. Mark Lamont Hill has a book out called "Nobody" that really looks at the current Black Lives Matter movement and the killings of black men and women at the hands of police. And a friend of mine who wrote a book called Invisible Man got the whole world watching that I also just recently read. Just really moving, and it takes you back to people's personal experiences, that this is not some abstract, thing, but there are people who are walking around us in our communities that we can't really see beyond their just physical appearance, but we can't see beyond their eyes and their hearts and their minds and what they're dealing with as being people of color in this country. So I've been very moved by those stories.
Thank you. I just also want to echo Mary's reference to the Understanding Race site. It's a public education project of the American Anthropological Association, and I think it's a really excellent tool for classroom use that also illustrates some of the ways in which we can do this kind of critical pedagogy in ways that are, that extend beyond the classroom, even as academics. Let alone in our own activist work. So I think we have time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I am also a student at the Graduate Center for Journalism. I see a couple of us here. I just wanted to know, just from the panel, if you guys have any tips and advice for young journalists in covering stories in a way that brings these issues to light in the media, since I know they're not really doing the best job of that.
There's a lot of power in personal stories. I think that's where a lot of the learning comes from. And so as a young journalist, really highlighting issues around social justice, particularly issues that challenge the norm, that are not often talked about, right? So, or there's this huge silence around it, like violence against women, or, there's numerous topics that really push us to think in more revolutionary ways. And, oftentimes when I teach my classes, I find that my students are thirsty to really talk about these issues. They're trying to make sense of the readings and everything. And we're in this country where, black bodies are literally getting murdered every day. It's this genocide, outright genocide on our community. And so giving youth an opportunity to share their stories and to interweave their stories in the coverage, I think would be good.
Yeah, I would say that as journalists, that part of what you have the opportunity to do is not let white people off the hook about race. I think that so many times the stories get reported, and there was just one about, I think it was in the New York Times or someplace pretty prominent, and it said that Trump is causing marital strife among married couples. And it was like, what, you mean white married couples, right? And the ignoring the whiteness, I think is a journalistic malpractice in the kind of dismal political climate that we have right now. So I think as journalists, you have a real opportunity to do that. And just one more piece on that, the reporting around who's voting for Hillary Clinton, the only when they start talking about women, the only women who have race are black women, and then we start talking about women, and they really mean white women, but they never talk about the whiteness of the white women who are supporting Hillary Clinton. So I think that kind of paying attention is one of the opportunities that journalists have.
And I'll add also, and I think that the best journalists are the ones that I follow, the ones that I'm willing to share their pieces, are the ones that are not caught in the larger mainstream frame that has been offered to them as journalists, right? I like the journalists who challenge the frame and want to talk about things from their own personal perspective. They look for the stories that haven't been told and they tell them. And sometimes that includes criticizing other media outlets if they have to in the way that they portrayed media. And, and a big, for me, just a recent example, we had this really horrible, obviously, attack here in New York City. And grateful that this guy, whoever he is, has been apprehended. But then the same day, a guy in Texas named Carrie Lee Ogborn was arrested with explosives and with the intent to blow up a building in Houston, right? Nobody heard about that. It was this local paper that wrote the story. Eventually more bloggers are picking it up, but this idea that the mainstream media believes and knows that you get higher ratings from talking about anything that's connected to some sort of international, terrorism, and that's the story, that's the ratings. But no one gets ratings from telling about white men who want to blow us up either, right? So I feel like being able to get being able to tell things from a different frame, and also looking around the media and saying, wait a minute, why are we having a conversation about Muslims, but ain't nobody talking to the Muslims, right? Like, sometimes we have a whole panel on reproductive rights on national television. I'm like, why are they all 5 white men talking about my body? Where are the women to talk about my body? Same thing when we talk about issues of police brutality. Sometimes, yes, there are people of color that are having that conversation, often missing women, black women to have those conversations. So I think as media, people in the media, using your platform to tell the story, the most untold stories, and eventually those journalists win Pulitzer Prizes and things. I'm just saying that's part of it.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to you all for attending today's event. We are going to be wrapping up our live stream, but we'd like to continue the conversation over coffee and snacks. And yeah, we encourage you to continue talking about these issues. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming our 3 panelists. Not welcoming, in thanking our 3 panelists, Mary Phillips, Jessie Daniels, and Linda Sarsour. Thank you so much.